Okay, it's time to start. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this Urbaria guest lecture. My name is Jussi Annes, and I work as a coordinator at Urbaria. And for those of you who don't know, Urbaria, aka the Helsinki Institute of Urban and Regional Studies, is the first academic multidisciplinary urban research unit in Finland. Our aim is to cultivate world-class urban research and education, as well as to improve the societal impact of our experts and their work. We also organize and facilitate a lot of events centered around urban research, such as this one. And we encourage all of you to look up Urbaria online to find out more about what we do. But now, without further ado, it's my great honor to welcome Meg Holden, Professor of Urban Studies and Resources and Environmental Management, who has come here all the way from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, to give us a talk on using our words to change the conventions of urban worlds. Please welcome on stage, Meg Holden.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for that very warm welcome. I can say kiitos. I just learned how to say salmon soup at lunchtime. So my Finnish is definitely slow, but improving. I've been spending summers assisting my Finnish-Canadian colleague Annika Airas with a field school that we offer in Helsinki. So it's been a great pleasure to get to know your city little by little. And I'm really excited to share some work that we've been doing together with an international group of researchers, including a strong presence of Finnish researchers. So let me get to it. Every city's story is a story of translanguaging. Cities that embed a threshold density of cultures and entangled lives, experiences, and forms come together in public and private, tangible and intangible processes, and they always feature the interactions of different languages. Languages carry cultures, express the range of understandings encountered within cultures, and provide pathways to grow, develop, or enhance. And where languages meet, these possibilities may multiply and even maybe resonate, although of course they may also, and they sometimes do, amplify discord. And that's the premise of this research project that has brought me here today. And here are my collaborators from Finland, Denmark, and France. I have some copies of what we call our green paper here on translanguaging and sustainability, if you're interested, as well as a brochure to explain it. And so first what I'm going to do today is I'm going to make a case about the connection between translanguaging, sustainability, and cities, which I expect is kind of shaky for most people in the room, and why we're bringing these three concepts together. And then I'm going to present a sort of a methodology that we're piloting in this project in order to demonstrate the work that this combination of ideas does. So cities have experience articulating and resolving challenges via diverse orders of justification and diverse knowledge bases. And these allow problems and potential solutions to be understood across languages and positions. This reality and pragmatic capability I refer to here as translanguaging. And I make the case that attentiveness to translanguaging goes well beyond the linguistic expertise needed to master languages via their classic building blocks of alphabet, terminology, grammar, and rhetoric. Instead, a multicultural and critical view of translanguaging reveals the dynamic effects of distinctive, shared, and relational exchanges across languages to understand, shape, and orient ourselves in our experiences, and ultimately to orient the city on any path of change. In this sense, translanguaging is an urban cultural competency. This competency begs to be fostered and applied for its important and undervalued role in a politics of urban transformation. So what I'm going to demonstrate is the understanding that can emerge from attention to translanguaging dynamics in some particular ways. And I'm going to talk about it specifically in terms of the politics of transformation towards a just and ecological future. And I'm going to make the case that when this fails to happen, as it does fail to happen, this is at least in part because the politics of transformation towards a just and ecological future are predominantly justified in a singular ideological register of Western science and a de facto lowest common denominator monolingual English. And it could be otherwise. Cities are vessels and attractors of many ways of knowing, articulating, and acting. The urban edge of diversity and mixing runs deeper and is a more consistent urban trait than the principle of limitless growth and development, even though the latter is the more common association with urbanism in Anglophone cities today. Cities already contain the intersectional combinations of language, of knowledge and imagination for a meaningful and achievable transformation pathway, although by extension, fear or stereotype the fact is that they don't bring their diversity of knowledges, imaginations, actions, and energies to bear on solutions. The co-evolution of language and urbanization often offer underexplored semiotic as well as socio-political opportunities for study and mobilization of a diversity of technologies, policy designs, social abstractions and distinctions, and collective memories. The pragmatic question that all of this begs is, what increases the possibility that encounters of diverse languages in the city generate common ground for a progressive urban sustainability transition rather than shutting down potential understanding at the site of exchange? So thought about in this way, failed efforts in urban transformative change may be less policy failures or even failures to communicate as they are failures to leverage the full scope of our communicative potential. This is a starting position that's not unlike this one taken by French sociologist Christian Topalov at the onset of his classic decade-long study of urban vocabulary in 8 languages called L'Aventure des mots de la ville. And you've had a chance to read that quote, so I won't read it to you. But in order to demonstrate to you the potential value of translanguaging in efforts to change cities, I'm going to introduce 4 distinct ways that we do translanguaging analysis in the urban research that we're piloting within the SAGA Translanguaging and Sustainability Research Project. But in order to get started with that, I'm going to step back from this to introduce relevant contextualizing thoughts from 2 thinkers from Turtle Island, or North America, who should persuade you that language is important to consider specifically when we seek to understand identity, knowledge, and change. And before I get started, I am going to talk about Indigenous culture and language today, and I want to make it clear that my knowledge of this doesn't come from my background personally. It doesn't come from my family background personally. It comes from my experience of the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada that has been ongoing since 2008. And which has given me and other non-Indigenous Canadians the privilege of learning from Indigenous people and references, and the opportunity to understand the challenge of urban transition as consistent with decolonization efforts in my city. And I just want to make a quick case that just to show that the population with Indigenous identity in Vancouver, which is the region in which I'm based, has been hovering sort of around 2.5% since the 1990s. And then the black grid there is a grid of the diversity of Indigenous languages which are spoken within the city of Vancouver. Cree writer Thompson Highway begins his 2022 Massey lecture series called Laughing with the Trickster on Sex, Death, and Accordions, with a comparative discussion of 3 languages. He speaks to the time in human evolution in which language jumped from the more than human landscape into humans' mouths as a spark of magic that gave birth to human mythology, and to the ways in which the process of generating living language continues to generate new magic today. And he recognizes different languages as exercising different muscles in their speakers, offering different powers of articulation, which can be compared with interesting results. Highway speaks to 3 languages that he knows best. Cree, which is the most spoken Indigenous language in Canada. There are about 90,000 speakers, and it's the one Indigenous language in which you can watch the hockey game on Friday nights on television, as well as English and French. Cree, he says, is a hysterical language. It's formulated to express the visceral joy of being alive. English is a language suited to creating intellectual magic, most comfortable communicating matters of science and abstraction. French, he says, is an emotional, sensuous language suited to the expression of love and pleasure. This distinctive magic of each of these languages, Highway explains, can be conceptualized as inhabiting a different region of the body of the speaker. English occupies the head, French occupies the chest, and Cree occupies the zone below the belt. The point is not to essentialize these languages or languages in general, but the characterization of the different resonance of different languages allows Highway to demonstrate that languages are creations that live within people differently, both shaping their speakers and being shaped by speakers. Also, that they mix and complement one another in ways that do our different cultures credit. While Highway acknowledges that Cree has appropriated many words and sounds from French and English since colonization, for example, he makes the case that English is relatively at a loss for words when it comes to visceral feelings of the guts and the genitals in comparison with Cree. On the flip side, English offers a vast repertoire of abstractions which don't translate well or at all into Cree. And in his translanguaging discussion relating French and Cree, Highway credits the French missionaries with bringing the sound le to the Cree language, which didn't exist pre-contact. The Mosinee Cree, so that's the word from which the word moose in English is derived, after colonization by the French, began calling themselves Ilelu, because they felt like they were better expressing the pleasure of being alive by using this new sound in this way, by virtue of the shape that making the L sound demanded of one's mouth, like licking an ice cream cone. Now, it goes without saying that for Highway, the encounter of both English and French with Cree happened in a context of oppression, racist delusions of supremacy, and the differences between French and English didn't prevent either language from being systematically employed to wage cultural genocide on Cree language, identity, and rights. The very existence of Highway's interpretation is a subversive demonstration of the failure of either language's project of domination and erasure, but that's not all. Highway's encounter with the language diversity of Cree, English, and French, the heuristic sense he makes out of the different understandings these languages offer, are a clear articulation of the relative values of different language repertoires mapped onto the human body and the sounds and expressions of humans acting in the world differently. The story also highlights the contingency of language values in relation to the other components of the language repertoire that exist in a given embodied, composite, heterogeneous, tension-filled aspect of life. So I hope you'll take from this introduction to Thompson Highway that multiplicity of language and identity is at the root of the idea of Canada, historically and to this day, that indigeneity continues to exist in Canada and to pose a meaningful challenge to our expectations of knowledge, institutions, and action, and that language differences are significant in this whole picture. Jumping back a couple of generations from Highway to another prolific writer and thinker, non-Indigenous American philosopher John Dewey is not known for his theory of language. However, at the end of his life, Dewey's philosophical concern with the gap between the world as it is given and the way we people seek to live in it landed on the need to focus on language dynamics. And in his end-of-life correspondence with Arthur F. Bentley, Dewey made this commitment that you can see on the screen. He's 91 years old, and he's saying, if I ever get the needed strength, I want to write on knowing as a way of behaving in which linguistic artifacts transact business with physical artifacts, tools, implements, apparatus, both kinds being planned for the purpose and rendering inquiry of necessity an experimental transaction. Now, Dewey died the next year at 92, leaving this intended task unfinished. But I think it's in Dewey's writings on psychology that we can glimpse where he was going with this intuition, I've kind of tried to sketch it out in the picture there, of the people engaging in the sharing of an understanding through the use of different forms of language and viewed as an experimental kind of process. And so Dewey's philosophy of psychology, which is well known, was published mostly in the 1880s and 90s. It's expansive, and it's ever committed to experience and experimentation. To know is one among many ways to experience, and Dewey saw the task of philosophical inquiry into knowledge as the work of determining the objects of experience that assemble in particular relationships, and in so doing become received as knowledge. While we can never discern the origins of experience except by referring to other preceding experiences, we can account for the relations of particular elements of experience within an infinite richness of relations, and thereby also discover why they are. So to know, we find out what experience says about a package of sensations, objects, and relations, and then we attempt to relate our consciousness. The result, when the inquiry is well done, is the satisfaction of creative intelligence in the dialectical means-ends relationship of experience and knowledge, recognizing the specific relationship and flow between the experience and the knowledge. And it might sound kind of obvious when I say it that way, but this stood in sharp contradiction to the way in which the response to stimulus idea was expressed within psychology at the time, which is sort of depicted by this classic example of the child and the candle here. So in the reflex arc theory of psychology, there was the assumption that this child is going to have the obvious stimulus of seeing the light of the candle, and once he gets the negative response of being burned by the candle, then he's always forever going to know that the candle is going to mean that you will be burned and you won't go to touch it. But what Dewey's formulation offers is that, in fact, there's uncertainty in the stimulus, because you don't know if this child's last experience with a candle might have been getting a birthday cake, or perhaps, the experience of a warm campfire, and you don't know what kind of a response that he's going to get when he approaches the candle. So the only thing that Dewey can say we do is we think those things together. We think the stimulus and the response together without trying to integrate them or deny the truth of either side. There are contradictions in our consciousness, and there is an unknown reality, but consciousness is not wholly contained in the individual, and knowledge is not untethered to human experience. These things have anchors, even though these anchors are only wedged into an ultimately unknowable reality. Into this set of mixed and uncertain stimuli and responses, in which the ends and the means are uncertain, and the business is adjustment to the social world, this transaction happens through communication. It happens through language. So what we would like to propose is that, in effect, a means to specify the method of translanguaging analysis is specifying what happens in the business of this transaction between the language and the physical artifacts in a pluriversal pursuit of urban transformation. The method works on observable and interpretable instances of language acting across the classic linguistic categories of sound, structure, and sense. And we're going to talk about it in terms of 4 different logics or domains: spread, grounding, evolution, and appeal. And each of these corresponds roughly to a disciplinary tradition, while the sum total of the translanguaging effect takes shape across the set. And we've come to this sort of characterization honestly because our research group is interdisciplinary and represents a sort of bias towards one of these disciplines. So this typology of methodological categories for translanguaging investigation transects and overlaps with the research fields in interpretation and translation in the case of the spread, the first one, social sciences, including cultural and indigenous studies, geography, sociology, and then for the second one, sociolinguistics in the case of the third, and then critical discourse analysis in the case of appeal. And in each of these 4 domains, a different aspect of the business transaction in translanguaging analysis becomes visible. The focus on translanguaging allows researchers to grasp the relation between socio-material elements of the given world and the values and ideals of a world that we would rather inhabit. And the gap, I think, is the space of research interest for advancing urban ecological transition. The gap provides the motivation to rise to the continuous challenge of confronting both the problems that we encounter and our uncertainty about the solutions that are being proposed. These are some terms that you might associate with some of these practices, and I'm going to go through them in turn so they will make more sense. So the first domain of approaches to translanguaging is what we're calling spread. So within interpretation and translation approaches, the observable dynamic is the spread of words and concepts from one language to the other. The dynamic is observable within terminological richness of languages that are captured through terminological databases. This one is the UN Term official database for translation of terms that are accepted by the United Nations. And acknowledging where, obviously a context of multilingualism is accepted and acknowledged and it's official. And therefore, it is essential to move smoothly across those languages through the development of term banks, for example. In the policy sphere, efforts in this domain establish expectations for access to communications of various types in various languages, contingent on the nature of the communication, the setting, and the implications for the discourse. So it's in this spirit that the Finnish government, for example, but I'll use the example in the French government, the Délégation de la langue française, that it exists as a body in order to ensure that the French language is fully functional and allows French interests to be represented at any table in which matters that might affect them are discussed. And it's in this spirit also that the EU Commission justifies allowances for only a small subset of the 24 official languages recognized in the EU to be used for communications that are determined to be of less than major significance. And it's in this spirit that we find it uncontroversial to encounter cities referring to themselves as green in a variety of official formulations without really calling them to account on the diversity of things that they might mean by that formulation or any correspondence between them. A growing amount of the work of this kind of translanguaging can, I have to admit, be accomplished with the help of advanced networks. So for enthusiasts of AI, Meta has developed a tool called the Seamless Massively Multilingual and Multimodal Machine Translation. It's currently in version 2. It's built with 101 languages for speech input and 35 languages for speech output. And it makes the claim that it has effectively conquered the challenges that automated translation has had in representing epiterminological aspects of language use, like culture, context, and conversationality. But the human effort of interpretation and translation can lead to many interesting surprises. The different structures and grammars that make up different languages, unique nomenclature and terminologies that elucidate matters differently in different language contexts, and even terms that are effectively untranslatable in spite of interpretation and translation effort. At least there is unavoidable loss of precision of meaning in a translation of terms that have a decisive uniqueness within their original language context. Multilingualism in this way of thinking about it presents translanguaging effectively as a challenge that it's going to take ongoing effort or larger and larger AI tokens to solve for perfect communicative rationality in the Habermasian sense. Underlying the immensity of the challenge of specifying the correspondence of each language with each other language is a sense of futility, really. I mean, how could we ever get that? There are almost 7,000 languages in the world. And if no one can ever truly know more than a few languages, our most rational approach to shared understanding is to pretend this uncertainty and friction doesn't exist, rather than get interested in it. Whether openly acknowledged or not, this way of thinking does constitute glottophobia, or the fear of the uncertainty of not knowing another language. The French neologism globish also can be invoked. It's kind of an alliterative term that sounds very snake-like and indicates this kind of sense of distastefulness of communication using a murky, a vague, or a muddled kind of common denominator English in business settings. Here I could make a point about the contribution of indigenous multilingualism that is particularly pertinent. In my region here, which is Vancouver, and then the surrounding, you can see that thick black line in the middle on the right map is the border between Canada and the United States. In British Columbia and Washington State, and then Vancouver Island is the largest island there on the west side. And those are showing the major language groups that exist across this territory. So in the city of Vancouver proper, there are two original language families. There's Halkomelem and there's Squamish. And these are they have two distinct origins. They have very different lettering, different sonoric patterns, different structures. So for as long as there have been people in this region, it has been multilingual, and multiply that by about 70 in the region as a whole. So you could ask why? Like, why is it multilingual? Intermarriage and trade ceremonies have been important throughout history and regular practices for the continuity of cultures. So why wouldn't the languages have blended over time? The answer that I've been given to this question by language speakers is that each nation has needed to maintain its own language in order to reflect the different knowledges of the people speaking them. How different could the knowledge be? I've wondered. They're essentially living in the same rainforest. They've got the same kind of food source mix, the same kinds of economic expectations. And what's been answered back to me is that it's a question of a different relationship. So it's like when I point at my colleague Annika and I say that to me as my friend, Giacomo sitting beside her can look at Annika and he's going to think of her in a slightly different way from his different positionality. And so that is a difference that has been essential to preserve over generations upon generations. And, in the context of genocide and occupation, this has been preserved against great odds as well. Multilingualism, in fact, I would say, is a strategy that's used by First Peoples in Canada to advocate for funding and for other supports for language learning and language revitalization, because the fact of multilingualism removes the excuse that any particular language might never have enough speakers in order to be an international language that would get the attention of Meta, for example. The real work isn't to sort of lift up one particular language, it's to preserve the distinct relationships, which is the translanguaging. The next methodological approach is grounding. So in the domain of translanguaging as grounding, we can begin with the insight from Hans-Georg Gadamer, the German sociologist, that increasing understanding is like cresting a hill in dialogue with another person and increasing the extent of the horizon that we see together. And the corollary for Gadamer was that all knowing was horizon seeing and horizon attaining. So this can be illustrated in the case of languages that are specialized and attain a level of differential comprehension, for example, within a professional group or a scientific community. We're not talking about, scientists aren't doing this in order to gain particular advantage politically or to gatekeep, well, it kind of is gatekeeping membership, but really they're doing it because it's handy in order to get to the nub of what they want to discuss in really specialized situations. So climate science, for example, is one of the areas in which such language specialization occurs. So when we hear climate scientists using the term GHG, it's not surprising that this conveys more meaning within the scientific community than it does to outsiders. And they have to revert to knowledge mobilization tactics like these kinds of cartoons in order to communicate the gist of the meaning outside that community. So grounded knowledges in this way allow for more profound community-based knowledge pursuit. And there's a trade-off to that, which is that outsiders have to have trust for that community in order to traverse that landscape and reach that horizon together. The other area in which grounding is an important dynamic to take into account in translanguaging is, again, with respect to Indigenous languages. And here I want to give another example that Indigenous languages can meaningfully be called land languages. They emerge from a particular landscape. They emerge in relation to the non-human elements of that particular landscape. Remember, Thomson Highway's story of languages sort of jumping out of the mouth of a human being in the first instance. So while a situation for specific understanding of terms and concepts within the language is comparable in some ways with the use of scientific language by climate scientists, the grounding is actually much more important for indigenous peoples in a land language context, because after all, this is existing within a subsistence economy where good knowledge of the plants, the water, the weather patterns is essential to survival. And the latter form of knowledge, which is knowledge invested within the landscape that emerges from these particular relationships with particular landscapes, is a crucially missing element of effective ecological transition within languages that are adapted for universalist communication. Indigenous languages continue to make ripples and sometimes shockwaves when they try and speak from that sense of groundedness to official Canadian institutions of law and policy. And these are some of the examples of the products, the policy products of this articulation. But the best way, perhaps, to illustrate the difference that a land language makes to the potential for urban ecological transition is to talk about land. So the concept of land ownership in English, and I believe in Finnish as well, includes concepts of individual ownership and the ability to profit from land that I own if I have title to that land. And treaties in Canada, they do exist, and they do demonstrate in that way of thinking certain Indigenous groups giving over land ownership to the British Crown or to the Government of Canada in some instances. However, although it's true that people gave away what was called in English at the time land ownership, we now know that they could not possibly intentionally have done this at the time they signed those original treaties, because within Indigenous knowledge systems demonstrated by translanguaging and legal scholarship by Indigenous peoples in the last several decades, land ownership is simply a different kind of idea. It ties a community's responsibilities to the land. Remember, their language comes from there. That's part of the way that they prove that. And that is therefore not alienable. And this difference in the grounded dimension of language has led to Indigenous land title being recognized and superimposed upon and not mixable with Canadian land title. And this is some of the important court decisions that have happened again and again repeatedly in Canada when Indigenous peoples have gone to court with other landowners under the Canadian land title system, and their independent and superimposed rights to the land have been recognized. So another way to think of how this takes shape outside the courtroom and in the spaces of the city, we can see this deep sense of groundedness in landscape results in some urban landscape surprises. So here is, you can see under construction, the first set of 3 new towers that are being built by the Squamish Nation on a parcel of inner city Vancouver land, which is their ancient village called Sanok, and that was taken away from them in 1913. Following a landmark court decision and the repurchase of some parcels, the Squamish Nation is now nearing completion on the development of 3 of these buildings. So you can see this is a graphic rendering, but you can see the mountain, Mount Nitchkai or Mount Garibaldi behind them to the north. And you can see that the set of 3 buildings in English is called mountains as well, so, or Nitchkai in Squamish Snikhim, in Squamish language. And they really are mountainous buildings. They are at least double the size of even the very tall buildings in the downtown peninsula that exist. But they represent a completely different kind of contribution to the urban landscape. So that is a big change. Here's a smaller scale change that this kind of translanguaging represents. Don't worry about the text, I'm going to show you it bigger in a second. The different meaning that comes from the grounding of Indigenous languages in the urban parks landscape is also beginning to take shape. So for example here, this sign is attached to this rewilded or meadowized lawn park, which is in a dense neighborhood in Vancouver, as you can imagine, before well, for those of you who are from Helsinki, if you remember 5 years ago what the Töölönlahti Bay area looked like, for example, and now has been turned into a habitat kind of meadow. And the sign that's affixed to this is the park board manager of decolonization really trying to plead with the users of this space to get them to understand that the different indigenous notion of what parks are for, or what the notion of park would even mean, because they don't have that language, that word in their language, what that would, how to relate to that. So here is her sort of plea. I'll give you a second to read it. And of course, it's written in English, so it's written for non-Indigenous people, for non-language speakers, and is the result of her care and attention to the need to try and work across the boundaries in order to make a new kind of case for change. All right, on to evolution. So the embedding of languages in landscapes, communities, and cultures isn't static, so we need an evolutionary approach that is able to accommodate changing contexts. Translanguaging in the domain of language evolution examines the fast and slow processes of mixing and change in languages and language repertoires. Multilingual and multicultural city life tends to speed up the pace of this change and render it more unusually creative. There's a notion of metrolingualism, the sort of creation of urban dialects and the ability to, the form that particular dialects take in particular cities. And sustainable development itself constitutes such a dialect, right? It emerged in the 1980s as this sort of construct of international diplomacy, of people who saw a change that was needed, but they didn't agree on what kind of change it was, with half of the people saying it was environmental degradation that needed to be addressed, and the other half saying it was human development that needed to be addressed. And so they concocted this sort of homunculus in the 1987 book, Our Common Future, and they gave rise to what has been a very successful birth of this new dialect. And maybe it's because the term sustainable development that was launched in this way at that time was so successfully adopted, although it's an oxymoron and although it lacks any grounding in a recognizable linguistic or cultural origin, that the next generation of similarly internationally minded, highly educated, mobile changemakers have persisted in the same vein of kind of dialect craft. And this is just a smattering of different kinds of terms that this new generation of terminological derivation has produced. So we have this steady stream of new ecological terms on international offer, all seeking to spark the necessary shift in thinking and living through interlinguistic communication potential, and they mostly float above any recognizable cultural reference. And maybe the time has come to revise that strategy and to pursue a change agenda that is justified in more culturally specific, multiple ways. Translations exist for all of these terms, so that's not the point. But these translations are intellectual constructs, and they're mostly perceived as imposed upon people, especially non-Anglophones. And an alternative to this, and what we're trying to work on in the Saga project, so here's an example of sort of that adoption or the imposition of that kind of language. And then the alternative, what we've been trying in different ways in the Saga project, is instead to ask in different languages, what is a concept of change that would be appealing to you? And this is a sampling of what students in a course of ours who had some reference to these particular languages said would mean that would be a valuable change that they would be willing to invest their attention in. And in our terms of transition project that we're now launching, what we're trying to do is kind of make this a more orderly approach, or a little bit more systematic. And we think there's a good reason to suspect that we're at an inflection point at which people with different linguistic repertoires are evolving terminologies with promise and potential for urban ecological transition. And we'd like to know what those are in different cities and in different languages, because we think it would help. That they may justify these terminologies differently, and noticing this may offer insights for mobilizing meaningful and inclusive change across the multilingual and multicultural contexts of our cities. Looking for these patterns in non-English contexts also offers important insights about the limitations of the English language when it comes to readiness for change beyond the contemporary hegemonic development context and patterns. So I have two examples. Oh yeah, so this is kind of what it looks like when we start to try and work with these terms. And I want to just give you two examples to maybe think through. This first one is, the word is bricoleur. So it's a French word, and it's a term of repute and social esteem in French. It refers to a person who knows how to fix things, who knows how to repair, knows how to reuse, knows how to fabricate new things that function, usually using informal materials, maybe in an informal workshop on sophisticated tools, kinds of things. There's a spirit of solidarity and human development and circular economy practice that it also invokes in the French context. So here is a picture of from a site in transition, so in the precursor, in the public engagement phase of the redevelopment of an eco-district in Paris at an old hospital site called Saint-Vincent-de-Paul. There is this citizen or resident use space that's created, and you can see the English translation of the invitation to use this space here: development in progress, progress in development. Come, enjoy. You don't have to work too hard if you don't want to. We're just learning to be better neighbors together. This is another example from another eco-district in Paris, and the corner sort of feature of this, I guess it would be where the K market would be in the Finnish development context, is a workshop. It's called En Ville Labo, which kind of means a workshop you want, or a workshop of desire. And it's a community hub where you can bring in appliances that are in need of repair, and you can also purchase refurbished appliances. And it's also a place for educational workshops. The city invests in it because it serves their zero waste goals. And it's it's an entryway. It's a physical entryway to activate the corner and welcome people into this neighborhood as well. So I have found something similar in the Finnish context. This is from an exhibit that showed in 2024-25 at the Helsinki Design Museum. It was called Fix, Huola ja Kirja. And it suggests a willingness to elevate the craft of bicycle maintenance in a similar kind of way. There was that screen with a kind of, unremarkable person not doing it because they think anybody's looking at them. There was sort of stadium seating that was set up around that to sort of elevate and tell people to settle in, look at this, important craftsperson doing this work. And then, oops. Yeah, but then in English, the term that comes closest is repair cafe, which does exist, but it's kind of a bit of a bourgeois formulation. It really doesn't invite anything like a sense of solidarity. Or the term DIY, which you'll also see, but carries a much more radical and not very socially esteemed connotation as well. It's more like, for those of you who ever paid attention to Canadian television shows, that there was a Canadian show called MacGyver that was about this sort of lone person who could just get out of any tough situation. Okay, one more example. It's the Danish word jernmaker. And this was actually selected as the word of the year by the Danish Language Board. And literally it translates to iron fields. And it's sort of, It's a pejorative term that's conjured for the political purpose of referring to the use of vast swaths of Danish agricultural land for photovoltaic installations. And that's a policy, it's a result of the policy of green transition in Denmark that pays farmers more to do this than it does to pay for the agricultural use. And the word is used politically to strengthen the case for common sense in the country's sustainability transition, where people want more than barren metal landscapes. We can see in the French language this concept of sobriété, which you can tell in English it translates to sobriety, but you would never say that in English, because in English all that word means is depriving yourself of drugs and alcohol. But in French it actually is a very sort of, again, it's a sort of a solidarity-driven term that applies to energy, materials, land use, water as well, and it's the idea of being much more comfortable doing with less. I do think there's clear links to the Finnish term sastiavaisuus, as my colleague Annika has introduced and patiently explained to me, and those are some of the kinds of changes and the translanguaging work that we're interested in deploying and making better use of. Here's a word from the Squamish language that is offered to us when we ask, how would you say sustainability in your language? And it's chen chen stue. Okay, moving on. So the final idea is of how to do translanguaging work is appeal. So this is the sort of the critical discourse analysis domain of politicized terminologies for political or economic gain. So words like buzzwords, nudges, and greenwashing should come to mind. These practices are pervasive. You see them in the urban landscape everywhere, and they become sophisticated as urbanites become more understanding of the multiple purposes and the multiple marketing attempts to get there and to manipulate their perceptions and their attention. The contribution of translanguaging to this domain of appeal in environmental communication and miscommunication and what is sometimes referred to as ecolinguistics is the exchange of coordinated choices of these words. So we think it's important to pay attention to the polysemic possibilities of language, which can lead to particularly acute divergences of meaning in times of transition. Not because we can get any more specific, it's still gonna be a grounds for debate anytime we actually dig into what these mean, but because if we expose the vagueness in the communication and the meaning across the boundaries of the intention, then we can get to a space for pragmatic problem solving. So those are the four categories. I hope that I have made my case for how translanguaging could work in an interesting way for understanding and advancing urban green transitions. The fact is that new policy, practice, and material objects are being introduced to the green city as cities shift into more operational responses to the challenges of sustainable development, climate change, and urban ecological transition. But our cities are so diverse and overdetermined by countervailing trends and priorities that it's often daunting to imagine how to intervene in a positive way. As researchers seeking to advance and facilitate these transitions, language is a lens that can be brought to the task and that carries substantial advantages. Cities are language rich. Language isn't a scarce resource, and if we give more attention to the languages that we have and that we use, the more our language repertoires and capacities will grow. And becoming more receptive to translanguaging doesn't require mastery. It's not like becoming fluent in a new language in order to pass a language exam. Translanguaging is instead a kind of a laudable urban skill of the urban bricoleur, right? It's working with what we've got and working to be open-minded about the exchanges that we make in knowledge and social understanding. Moreover, if we're serious about democratic urban ecological transition, we have a collective obligation to find more and better ways to relate to and include the views of all of us in urban ecological transition solutions. There are many lessons for sustainable urbanism from a translanguaging approach. One undeniable lesson is to feel inspired by this sense of an opening up of possibilities. We surprise ourselves, perhaps, that our minds are maybe not entirely colonized yet. And this kind of translanguaging offers emotionally stirring possibilities, even if the nature of the changes are still inchoate and indeterminate. The expression of the understanding, nevertheless, represents a sense of revitalization, of inclusion, of more of the fullness of the identity of the place within our planning for it. This is the nature of a pluriversal planning. And here I'll recommend to you the edited volume by Marisol de la Cadena and colleagues, World of Many Worlds, about pluriversal planning. That accepts multiple sources of knowledge and the necessary corollary that every one of us has imperfect understanding across the urban landscape, but this level of imperfection decreases if we can learn to understand more diverse voices. I rest my case, but I'm open for questions. Thank you very much for your attention. I know, Hassam, you've got questions because you're gonna.
I mean, I can start to give people some time to process. Thank you for the really interesting and fascinating talk. Given our shared sort of like theoretical background, of course, what I was thinking is that you make a really good and solid case for the kind of plurality of people and languages and the kind of like relationship with physical objects and places presented in that plurality. But then there's of course the other side, which is the kind of like, one is the opening up of the plurality, and the other side is the kind of like coming together to form some kind of a compromise and sort of like deciding how to go sort of like forward in the situation. And sort of like being a sociologist, of course, sometimes that process can be a sort of like there are complications in that kind of process. So I don't know. I'd like to hear like a reflection on kind of that part of the process in planning and city construction.
Well, I would say that we focus too much on the concern that we would never be able to find a compromise, and that if we can suspend that disbelief, that different kinds of alternatives may appear. Like, I'm not serious, I mean, I'm not kidding, I am serious that there are court decisions from the highest court of the land in Canada that gives people's private property that they have paid millions of dollars for sometimes to another group of people. It gives them the rights to that, although they have a piece of paper that says they have rights to that. And now we have to work that out. That is, you know, and there are not only different languages, but different whole knowledge systems of relationships embedded in that. And it's a good challenge to have, I guess, is what I would say. I mean, yeah, I mean, the hard part is that, you know, well, so what if there are truly, you know, there are lines that we would not cross with respect to those diversities, and yeah, there I don't necessarily have a great answer for that. Except that the focus on language is nonviolent.
Thank you very much. Quite inspiring. I'm a bit worried also about the technocratic language from the same language group, for example, English, in the land use policy.
Mm-hmm.
If in social scientist or an architect or a planner, they are what I would like to put here is that there is no universality in the communication of the public good within the same language itself when we are talking about the discipline or the background. A land use planner who talk about floor-built efficiency of 2.0,
Right.
very numerical, while a social scientist who talk about place attachment and people relation to the space belonging or this kind of package. These sounds at many consequences two different languages, even though they are might be written in the same language. So I think that here also that this kind of flow of meaning between different disciplines in the same language, sometimes they are miscommunicating.
Mm-hmm. But I think that the way I'm very familiar with that kind of a dispute in which the numbers person is often going to be the one who wins the argument in a planning context. And I would say that translanguaging is a different way to have that argument. So again, using the entry of indigenous language into that conversation, which has to happen in a context of decolonization because there is a policy and a legal commitment to integrate indigenous access to that forum for decision making, then an indigenous perspective would be, that unit of area is based on, or that floor space ratio is not based on the logic of how we use that interior space, because the interior space is only a very small part of the space that we use to conduct our living activities. So we in fact need to think about it. We need to think about the denominator differently. And I think that if without language it's a little bit of a tool that way. You see, it's not doing it's not getting rid of the problem that you're presenting. It's a different wrench to use to sort of like tighten the screws on that sort of masquerade of efficiency in order to shortchange the more fulsome discussion of the public interest that we need to have when we're talking about, scarce resources and different priorities and whole different understandings of what the city's for. Yeah. Yeah.
Just my question is how we think this research, how do you overcome the unevenness in terms of power among languages?
Yeah.
Even within the urban environment itself, I think there are languages that are spoken that immediately configure as someone else. There are languages which are the languages of the elite. There are languages which are, there are accents which are
For sure.
determining that. So how do you handle that aspect?
Yeah. Well, recognizing it, I think, is the first thing, right? So to recognize it and to create the space that gets away from this sense that there has to be a hierarchy of languages. So if we value multilingualism as part of a sustainable transition, a sustainability transition, it's not, we can't do it without this kind of diversity. We've just been through, certainly in North America, we've just been through this whole period of expanding our understanding of the place of cultural diversity in cities in order to have it really blow back and kick us in the teeth. Well, let's try a different approach that's maybe more universally recognizable, which is we all speak different languages, and see if we can start again to have that question about multiplicity. Yeah. Do some of you have to leave for 3 p.m.? Is that what's going on? I don't want to keep you if you want to. Can I get a show of hands, especially from the younger people? Do you think that, who here would say, and Veiko, you need to face the front so that they feel like they can They don't have. No, you have to face the front, not to. You don't stare at them. So you can feel free. You can tell me if you're not convinced. Do you think that language matters to a green transition in cities? Okay, I got maybe half the audience. Oh, a little bit more than half. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Yes.
Is it, at least to me, it sometimes sounds a bit like closer to linguistic determinism, and like that it influences it too much the way that you work. If you think about it, I don't know.
Yeah, so I hear you, and I didn't really go into quite a lot of detail about this chart, but I don't think that language is everything. So this is sort of like a flow chart where there are terms that are simply translated, and it actually is pretty much frictionless. And we don't have to focus on all of those terminologies. And then there are some at the sort of end of the process where we have to admit there's something that needs to be held on to here as well.
But is it the language or the culture that preserves it?
Well, that language is the carrier of culture. And I think I would say like this problem that Giacomo has presented, which is if you don't kind of, or actually it was more Hassam who presented this challenge, that if you don't sort of nail down culture, then it's always going to lose out to the more efficiency-based argument.
Okay, thank you for a really inspiring
Thank you.
lecture. Let's give
Thanks
one more
very
big round of applause.